Rain tapped softly against the window of the laundromat apartment, a steady rhythm that had become as familiar to Elias as his own breath. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed staring at the damp patch on the ceiling that grew a little bigger every time it stormed. Outside, the city hummed. Cars hissed through wet streets, a distant siren wailed, and somewhere down the block a street musician played a tired tune on a slightly out-of-tune saxophone. Elias used to notice every note. Once he could have told you the key, the tempo, even the emotion behind the player's phrasing. But that was a lifetime ago. Now music felt like a ghost, present but untouchable. He hadn't played piano in 12 years. Not since the night Leora died. She'd been 17, bright-eyed, stubborn, and endlessly curious. While Elias buried himself in scales and sonatas, she filled their tiny childhood home with laughter, poetry, and questions about stars, justice, and why people cried at happy endings. She believed in him more than anyone ever had. "You're not just good, Eli," she'd say, perched on the piano bench beside him, swinging her legs. "You're going to make people feel things they didn't know they could feel." Then, one icy December morning, a car skidded on black ice. And just like that, the world went quiet. After the funeral, Elias tried to play, but every note echoed with her absence. The melodies twisted into grief, so he stopped. He boxed up his sheet music, sold his upright piano for a fraction of its worth, and walked away from the conservatory, from auditions, from everything that reminded him of sound. He took jobs that required no creativity, stocking shelves, washing dishes, fixing leaky faucets in old buildings. He spoke only when necessary. He kept to himself, and for over a decade that was enough, or so he told himself. But that morning, something changed. On his way back from dropping off laundry, he passed a lamppost plastered with flyers. Most were torn or faded, but one caught his eye, a crisp, cream-colored poster with elegant black lettering, Orpheus Theater Open Audition, all talents welcome. No experience required, one chance, one stage, one moment to be heard. Elias stood there, rain dripping off the brim of his worn cap. He didn't know why he stopped. Maybe it was the word heard. Maybe it was the memory of Leora's voice whispering, "Just one more song, Eli. For me." He didn't plan to go, but the next day, he found himself standing outside the Orpheus Theater, a grand old building with marble columns and stained glass windows that glowed gold in the afternoon sun. His boots were muddy, his coat frayed at the cuffs, and his hands were rough from years of manual work. Inside, the lobby buzzed with energy. Young women in sequined dresses stretched their arms, humming warm-up scales. Men in crisp shirts adjusted bow ties, chatting about Chopin and Liszt like old friends. A cellist tuned her instrument with calm precision. Everyone belonged, except him. He almost turned around. But then a stagehand called his name, Elias Varel, and gestured toward a side door. "You're next." The audition room was smaller than he expected, but the piano in the center was magnificent. A black Steinway, polished to a mirror shine, its lid propped open like wings ready to take flight. A few people lingered in the back, judges maybe, or just curious onlookers. Among them sat a man with sharp eyes and a permanent frown, arms crossed, looking thoroughly unimpressed. Elias walked slowly to the bench. The room fell quiet, not out of respect, but because they expected a joke. Someone snickered. Another whispered, "Is he lost?" He ignored them, sat down. The wood was cool beneath him. The keys gleamed under the soft lights. For a moment, his mind went blank. Then, without thinking, his fingers hovered above the middle C. He wasn't here to impress. He wasn't here to win. He was here because, for the first time in years, he missed the weight of his own voice, spoken not in words but in music. He took a breath and played. It wasn't perfect. The first few notes came out shaky, uncertain, but then something shifted. His fingers remembered. Not the technical drills or the flashy arpeggios he'd practiced as a student, but something deeper. A melody he'd started the night Leora died. He'd never finished it. He'd tucked it away in a drawer and tried to forget it existed. Now it poured out of him. The piece began softly, just a few sparse notes like footsteps in an empty house. Then a gentle left-hand pattern emerged, steady as a heartbeat. The right hand wove a simple aching theme, full of longing but not despair. It wasn't sad in the way people expected grief to sound. It was tender, human, real. The snickers stopped. A woman in the front row leaned forward, her program forgotten in her lap. The cellist in the corner closed her eyes. Even the frowning man uncrossed his arms. Elias didn't notice. He was somewhere else, back in their childhood living room where Leora would sit cross-legged on the rug, chin in her hands, listening as he played for hours. He could almost hear her say, "Again, Eli," from the part where it feels like hope. His fingers moved faster now, not with showy speed, but with purpose. The music swelled, not loud but full, like a wave gathering strength before it breaks. He added harmonies he'd never written down, improvising as if the piano were speaking through him. It wasn't about technique anymore. It was about truth. When he reached the unfinished part, the place where he'd always stopped, he didn't freeze. Instead, he let his hands drift into something new. A question, not an answer. An open door, not a locked one. The final chord hung in the air, soft and unresolved. Silence followed. Not the kind that meant failure, but the kind that meant something had shifted. Elias opened his eyes. His hands trembled slightly on the keys. He stood, nodded once to no one in particular, and walked out before anyone could speak. He didn't look back. Outside, the rain had stopped. Puddles shimmered under streetlights. He walked quickly, heart pounding, not from fear but from something unfamiliar. Relief, release. He couldn't name it. Back in his apartment, he sat by the window, listening to the distant hum of the city. For the first time in years, it didn't feel lonely. It felt possible. He didn't know it yet, but someone had been watching. Someone who rarely paid attention to open auditions. Someone who'd spent years searching for music that didn't just sound beautiful, but felt alive. And that man, sitting in the back with the sharp eyes and the frown, hadn't moved since the last note faded. He was already making plans. Upstairs, his apartment smelled faintly of soap and old paper. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall where a single photo hung in a thrift store frame. Leora, grinning in a sunflower yellow dress, her arms flung wide like she was hugging the whole world. He hadn't spoken her name out loud in years, but today, without meaning to, he whispered, "I played it, Lee." He didn't feel proud. He felt exposed, like he'd opened a door he'd nailed shut long ago and now the wind was rushing through, stirring up dust he'd hoped would stay buried. Meanwhile, back at the Orpheus Theater, the room remained still for a full minute after Elias left. No one clapped. No one whispered. They just sat there as if waking from a dream they didn't want to forget. In the back row, Theo Marlowe finally moved. He stood slowly, his coat rustling, and walked toward the stage. He didn't look at the judges or the other auditioners. His eyes stayed fixed on the piano as if it might vanish if he blinked. Theo wasn't supposed to be there. As the theater's artistic director, he rarely attended open calls. Too many amateurs, too much wasted time. But tonight he'd come on a whim, restless after another sleepless night. His wife Mira had loved these kinds of events. "You never know when lightning will strike," she used to say. She'd been gone 3 years now, taken by a sudden illness that left Theo hollowed out and sharp around the edges. He'd thrown himself into work, canceling anything sentimental or unpolished. Under his leadership, the Orpheus had become known for technical perfection, but critics whispered it had lost its soul. Until tonight. He approached the stage manager, who was shuffling papers. "Who was that?" Theo asked, voice low. "Elias Varel," the man replied, glancing at his clipboard. "No agent, no résumé. Just showed up with a name and a number." Theo nodded. "Find him." The next morning, Elias was fixing a leaky faucet in the building next door when a shadow fell across the hallway. He looked up, wrench in hand, and saw a man in a dark overcoat standing a few feet away. Not threatening, just waiting. "You played yesterday," the man said. His voice was calm, but there was something urgent beneath it. Elias wiped his hands on his jeans. "Yeah, and?" "I'm Theo Marlowe, artistic director at the Orpheus." Elias stiffened. "I'm not looking for a job. I'm not offering one." Theo stepped closer. "I just want to know. What was that piece?" Elias hesitated. He could shut the door, walk away. But something in Theo's eyes, tired, searching, made him pause. "It doesn't have a real name," he said finally. "I call it Leora's window." "Why?" "Because she used to sit by the window and listen while I practiced." Said it sounded like sunlight through glass. Theo was quiet for a moment. "Then, you stopped playing for 12 years?" Elias looked down at his hands, calloused, stained with grease. Music stopped making sense after she died. And now it does? I don't know, Elias admitted. But yesterday, it felt like I owed her that much. Theo didn't push, didn't flatter. He simply said, "Would you mind if I listened again?" Not in an audition, just as a person. Elias almost said no. But the truth was, he didn't want the music to disappear again. So he nodded. That evening, Theo returned, not with a contract or a camera crew, just a thermos of tea and a folding chair. Elias cleared a space in his tiny living room, dragged out a battered keyboard he'd bought years ago for $50 and sat down. He played the piece again, slower this time, more deliberate. Theo listened without moving, his eyes closed for most of it. When it ended, he opened them. "It's unfinished," he said softly. "Yeah," Elias replied. "I never knew how to end it." "Because you were trying to fix grief," Theo said. "But grief isn't a problem to solve. It's a place to live in, carefully." Elias looked at him surprised. "You sound like you know." Theo's expression softened. "My wife used to say music should leave room for silence, that the spaces between notes are where people breathe." They talked for hours that night, not about careers or fame, but about loss, memory, and the strange way art can hold both pain and beauty at once. Theo didn't mention the gala, didn't pitch a performance. He just listened. And for the first time in years, Elias felt seen, not as a failed musician, but as someone who'd carried something heavy for a long time. Over the next few days, Theo came by often. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in silence while Elias played fragments of old pieces, testing his fingers like they were old friends relearning each other's rhythms. Theo brought pastries from the bakery down the street. Elias made weak coffee in a chipped pot. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was something real. Then one rainy afternoon, Theo leaned forward in his chair and said, "The gala's in 3 weeks. I want to feature your piece." Elias froze. "No, hear me out," Theo said gently. "Not as a novelty act. Not as a sob story, but as the heart of the second act, a moment of stillness in a night full of noise." "I'm not ready," Elias said, voice tight. "Nobody's ever ready," Theo replied. "But the world needs to hear this. Not because it's perfect, but because it's honest." Elias looked out the window. Raindrops slid down the glass like tears. He thought of Leora, how she'd always believed his music could reach people, how she'd say, "Don't hide it, Eli, share it." He took a deep breath. "Only if I can finish it my way. No changes. No fancy arrangements." Theo smiled. "A real one, rare and warm. Your way is the only way that matters." Rehearsals began the following week. The Orpheus rehearsal hall was grand, with high ceilings and velvet curtains, but Elias felt out of place among the polished musicians. Still, Theo made sure he had space, literally and emotionally. He arranged for Elias to practice alone at first, then slowly introduced him to the small string ensemble that would accompany him. The musicians were skeptical at first. This quiet man in worn boots didn't look like a soloist. But then they heard him play. During one session, the lead violinist, a woman named Nia with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes, stayed behind after rehearsal. "That melody," she said, "it reminds me of my daughter. She passed last year." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Elias just nodded, and that was enough. Word began to spread backstage. Not gossip, respect. People started listening when Elias spoke. They saved him a seat at lunch, asked how his hands were holding up. Small kindnesses, but they mattered. Still, doubt crept in at night. What if he froze on stage? What if the audience didn't understand? What if he failed Leora all over again? But then he'd remember Theo's words. The spaces between notes are where people breathe. And maybe, just maybe, his music could give someone else room to breathe too. As the gala drew closer, Elias played every evening in his apartment, refining the unfinished section. He wasn't trying to make it grand or triumphant anymore. He was trying to make it true, and truth, he was learning, didn't need applause to be real. But it did need to be shared. The days blurred together in a quiet rhythm. Morning coffee, afternoon rehearsals, evening practice under the dim lamp in his apartment. Elias no longer flinched when he heard the piano's voice. Instead, he leaned into it like relearning the shape of an old friend's hand. But the ending, the final passage of Leora's window, still wouldn't come. He'd play through the piece, strong and steady, right up to the last few bars, and then his fingers would hover uncertain. It was as if the music knew it wasn't ready to say goodbye. Theo noticed. He didn't push, but one evening after a long rehearsal, he lingered as the others filed out. "You're trying to wrap it up neatly," he said, leaning against the piano. "Like grief has a finish line." Elias wiped his brow with the back of his hand. I don't want it to feel sad. Not all the way through." "Who said it has to?" Theo asked. "Maybe it doesn't need an ending. Maybe it just needs to open a door." Elias frowned. "What does that mean?" Theo walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. "When Mira died, I thought I had to move on. Put it behind me. But that's not how it works. You don't move on. You move with it. Like carrying a stone in your pocket, not heavy enough to stop you, but enough to remind you what matters." Elias sat quietly, letting that settle. He'd spent years thinking music had to resolve, had to conclude with certainty, but life didn't work that way. Leora was gone, yes, but her laughter, her questions, the way she'd tilt her head when she listened, those things still lived in him. Maybe the music didn't need to fix that. Maybe it just needed to hold it. That night, instead of forcing an ending, Elias went for a walk. He wandered through the park near his building, the same one he and Leora used to visit as kids. Back then, they'd feed bread to the ducks and argue about whether clouds had feelings. Now the park was quiet, lit by old-fashioned street lamps that cast long shadows on the wet grass. A few people passed by, a couple holding hands, an old man walking a sleepy dog, a teenager sketching under a tree. He sat on a bench near the pond. The water was still, reflecting the sky like a dark mirror. And then it hit him. Grief wasn't the opposite of joy. It was the price of it. You couldn't love deeply without risking loss, and maybe that was okay. He walked home faster than he'd come, his mind racing. When he got to his apartment, he didn't take off his coat. He went straight to the keyboard and began to play. Not the old version, but something new. The melody returned, familiar and warm, but this time, when it reached the unfinished part, it didn't stop. It opened. Soft chords bloomed like morning light. The left hand played a gentle, repeating pattern, steady, patient. The right hand floated above it, not with answers, but with questions that didn't need solving. It felt like walking into a room you'd left long ago and finding it still waiting for you. When he finished, his hands rested on the keys, trembling slightly. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. The next morning, he called Theo. "I think I've got it," he said. That afternoon, they met in the rehearsal hall. Theo sat in the front row alone. Elias played the new ending slowly at first, then with more confidence. When the last note faded, Theo didn't speak right away. He just sat there, eyes closed, as if holding the sound inside him. Finally, he opened his eyes. "That's it," he said softly. "That's the heart of it." Rehearsals shifted after that. With the piece complete, the ensemble began to truly listen, not just to their parts, but to the story the music was telling. Nia, the violinist, started weaving her lines around Elias's melody like ivy around a trellis, supportive, never overpowering. The cellist added depth, a low hum that felt like memory itself. Even the lighting crew began adjusting their cues to match the mood of the piece. Soft gold for the opening, cool blue for the middle, then a slow return to warm light at the end. Elias still felt nervous, but it was different now. It wasn't fear of failure, it was the weight of responsibility. He wanted to do right by Leora, by Theo, by everyone who'd shown him kindness without asking for anything in return. One evening, after rehearsal, Nia handed him a small envelope. "From the stagehands," she said with a knowing smile. Inside was a note. "We've heard a lot of music in this theater. Yours is the first that made us stop sweeping and just listen." Elias tucked the note into his coat pocket, right over his heart. As the gala drew closer, the theater buzzed with final preparations. Costumes were fitted, programs printed, flowers ordered. Elias avoided the main lobby. He didn't want to see the posters with his name on them. He still couldn't believe he was part of it. But Theo made sure he stayed grounded. They'd eat lunch together in the staff break room, talking about everything except the performance, books, weather, the stubbornness of old pianos. "You know," Theo said one day, stirring sugar into his tea, "I used to think art had to be flawless to be valuable. And now?" Elias asked. "Now I think it has to be human." The night before the gala, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat by his window watching the city breathe. He thought about Leora, not with the sharp pain of before, but with a quiet tenderness. He imagined her in the audience, grinning that wide sunflower smile. "You did it, Eli," she'd say. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be present. The next morning, he put on the simple black suit Theo had arranged. Nothing flashy, just clean lines and quiet dignity. When he arrived at the Orpheus, the backstage area was a whirlwind of last-minute chaos. Dancers stretching, singers humming scales, crew members shouting into headsets. But when Elias walked in, a hush fell over his corner of the wing. The musicians nodded at him. Nia gave his shoulder a light squeeze. Theo appeared, looking more composed than usual, though his eyes were bright with something unspoken. "Ready?" he asked. Elias took a breath. "As I'll ever be." He didn't know what would happen when he sat at that piano in front of hundreds of strangers. But for the first time in 12 years, he wasn't running from the music. Backstage at the Orpheus Theater, the air smelled of rosin, old wood, and nervous energy. Elias stood just beyond the heavy velvet curtain, his fingers resting lightly against the wall as if steadying himself against a tide. He could hear the muffled swell of the audience, laughter, rustling programs, the clink of ice in glasses from the lobby bar. The gala had begun an hour ago, and the first act, a dazzling ballet set to a modern symphony, had just ended to thunderous applause. Now the stagehands were making final adjustments. A single spotlight waited, trained on the grand piano at center stage. Elias wore the simple black suit Theo had chosen for him. It fit well, but it felt strange, like wearing someone else's skin. He wasn't used to being seen not like this. For years he'd moved through life like a shadow, quiet, unnoticed, safe. But tonight there was no hiding. Nia appeared beside him, tuning her violin one last time. "Nerves?" she asked, not looking up. "A little," Elias admitted. She smiled. "Good, means you care." He watched as the stage manager gave a silent signal. The lights in the auditorium dimmed. A hush rolled through the crowd like a wave pulling back from shore. Theo stepped onto the stage, elegant in a charcoal suit, and addressed the audience with his usual calm authority. But when he mentioned Elias's name, his voice softened, just slightly, like he was sharing a secret. "Tonight," Theo said, "we offer you not a performance but a moment. A piece born not in a concert hall but in silence, in loss, in love. Please welcome Elias Farrell." Polite applause followed, curious, cautious. Elias knew what they were thinking. Who is this man? Why is he here? He'd seen the glances earlier, the raised eyebrows when his name appeared in the program. Some had even whispered when he walked through the green room. He didn't blame them. He looked more like a handyman than a featured artist. But then he stepped into the light. The piano gleamed under the spotlight, its surface catching the glow like dark water. He walked slowly, deliberately, and sat. The bench was firm, familiar. He placed his hands above the keys and closed his eyes. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the first note. It floated out. Soft, clear, like a single drop of rain hitting glass. The audience stilled. Even the rustling of programs stopped. Elias didn't rush. He let the silence breathe between the notes, just as Theo had said. The melody unfolded slowly, tenderly, like someone unfolding a letter they'd kept for years but were finally ready to read. He played Leora's Window exactly as he'd shaped it. No embellishments, no showy flourishes. Just truth laid bare. The strings entered gently behind him, not competing but cradling the piano line like hands holding something precious. Nia's violin wept without words. The cello murmured like a memory returning. Halfway through, Elias forgot the crowd. Forgot the cameras that might be rolling. Forgot everything except the music and the girl who'd believed in it, and in him long before anyone else did. His fingers moved with a certainty that surprised even him. Not because he'd practiced endlessly, but because this piece had lived inside him all along. He just needed the courage to let it out. When he reached the new ending, the part he'd written in the park, he didn't falter. The chords opened like dawn breaking over a quiet hill. There was no grand finale, no crashing climax, just a gentle release like letting go of a breath you didn't know you were holding. The last note hung in the air, delicate and unresolved. And then, silence. Not the awkward kind. Not the kind that follows a mistake. This silence was full, heavy with feeling. As if the entire theater had leaned in and forgotten to exhale. Elias opened his eyes. For a long moment, no one moved. No one clapped. They just sat there, stunned, as if waking from a dream they never wanted to leave. Then, from the third row, a woman stood. A second later, a man in the balcony rose to his feet. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the whole audience was on their feet, not out of politeness, but out of something deeper. Awe, recognition, gratitude. The applause began slowly, then swelled into a roar. Not the kind that celebrates technical skill, but the kind that honors honesty. Elias didn't bow. He simply placed his hands in his lap and looked down, overwhelmed. His throat tightened. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't wanted it even, but now that it was here, it felt like a gift. Not just to him, but to Leora too. Backstage, Theo watched from the wings, arms crossed, but his eyes shone. One of the stagehands wiped his cheek with the back of his hand and muttered, "I didn't know music could do that." After the ovation, Elias slipped away before anyone could swarm him. He didn't want interviews or handshakes. He just needed air. He stepped out into the theater's narrow service alley, where the city night wrapped around him like a familiar coat. Rain had started again, light, misty, and it cooled his face. He leaned against the brick wall and let out a long breath. It was over, and yet it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the first real beginning in 12 years. Inside, the gala continued. But out here in the quiet, Elias finally felt like himself again. Not the ghost of a pianist, not the man who'd disappeared, but someone who'd returned. Not unchanged, but whole in a new way. He didn't hear Theo approach, but he felt his presence. "You were magnificent," Theo said softly. Standing beside him, Elias shook his head. "I just played what was true." "That's the hardest thing to do," Theo replied. "And the rarest." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the distant hum of the city and the muffled music from inside the theater. Then Theo reached into his coat and handed Elias a small envelope. "What's this?" Elias asked. "A key," Theo said. "To a practice studio at the conservatory. It's yours if you want it." Elias turned the envelope over in his hands. "Why?" "Because the world needs to hear the rest of your songs," Theo said. "Not just this one. All of them." Elias looked up at the sky, where the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Somewhere above the clouds, stars were waiting. He thought of Leora, of her endless questions, her belief that beauty mattered. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled. Not a big smile, but a quiet one. The kind that starts deep inside and finally reaches the surface. He didn't know what came next. But for once, that was okay. He had music again. And that was enough. Write Part 5. In 1,400 words, without heading, in simple English words in a separate document. It should be interesting, and every part should be engaging so the audience doesn't get bored. Also keep the wording simple and natural tone. Also make the script human-centric and don't give feel of AI-generated. Also don't create violated content which can affect YouTube policy. Also don't use names like Marcus, Sarah, Emma, Jamal, etc. Profile Quen 3 Max 6:38 am the morning after the gala. Elias woke to sunlight streaming through his window, something that rarely happened since he usually rose before dawn. He lay still for a moment, listening to the ordinary sounds of the city. A delivery truck rumbling down the street, a neighbor humming as she watered her plants, the distant chime of a bicycle bell. Everything felt the same, and yet nothing was. He sat up slowly, his body stiff from tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. On the floor beside his bed lay the black suit, crumpled like a shed skin. He picked it up, brushed off a bit of dust, and hung it in the closet. Not because he'd never wear it again, but because it no longer felt like a costume. The envelope Theo had given him sat on the kitchen table, next to a half-empty mug of cold coffee. Elias opened it again, even though he'd already looked inside 3 times. The key was small and silver, attached to a tag that read Studio 4B, Royal Conservatory. He turned it over in his palm. It felt light, but it carried weight. He didn't rush to the conservatory that day. Instead, he went about his usual routine, fixed a leaky pipe in the building next door, bought bread from the corner bakery, fed the stray cat that sometimes slept on his fire escape. But now people looked at him differently. The baker nodded with a quiet smile. The building manager clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Heard you move some folks last night." Even the cat purred louder than usual. It wasn't fame. Not the kind that fills stadiums or trends online. It was something quieter, deeper. Recognition. Not for being flashy or perfect, but for being real. 2 days later, Elias finally walked through the gates of the Royal Conservatory. He hadn't been back since he left, and the place felt both familiar and foreign. The stone steps were worn smooth by generations of students. Ivy climbed the walls like it was holding the building together. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish, old paper, and the faint echo of 100 instruments playing at once. A young receptionist, eyes wide with recognition, handed him a visitor's pass without asking for ID. "Studio 4B is down the hall. Second door on the left," she said, voice hushed as if she were in a library. He found the room easily. It was small but bright, with tall windows that looked out over the courtyard. In the center stood a well-loved upright piano. No grand Steinway, but solid, warm, full of character. He ran a hand over the keys. They were slightly yellowed with age, but they responded with a soft, honest tone. He sat down and played nothing at first. Just let his fingers rest. Then slowly he began to improvise, no plan, no pressure. A simple melody emerged, different from Leora's window, but born from the same place, not pain, but presence. Over the next few weeks, Studio 4B became his second home. He came most mornings, sometimes staying until dusk. He didn't compose for an audience. He composed because the music asked to be heard. Some days he wrote pieces that sounded like rain on rooftops. Others felt like walking through an empty train station at night, lonely but peaceful. He started keeping a notebook, scribbling ideas between repairs and errands. Theo visited often, always unannounced, always with a paper bag of pastries. They rarely talked about the gala. Instead, they spoke about the weather, the stubbornness of old pianos, the way certain chords could make your chest ache in the best way. Their friendship grew quietly, like ivy on a wall, steady, unshowy, strong. One afternoon, Nia stopped by with her violin. "Thought I'd see if you needed a second voice," she said. They played together for an hour, weaving piano and strings into something neither could have made alone. Afterward, she said, "You could teach if you wanted." Elias shook his head. "I'm not the teaching type." "Maybe not," she replied. "But kids need to hear music that doesn't pretend everything's fine. They need to know it's okay to feel things deeply." He thought about that long after she left. A few weeks later, a local high school reached out. Their music program had lost funding, and they were looking for volunteers. Theo mentioned Elias's name without asking first. When the call came, Elias almost said no. But then he remembered Leora, how she'd begged him to play for her class once, how the kids had sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide with wonder. So he said yes. He started with one class a week. He didn't lecture. He just played and let the students ask questions. "Why does that part sound sad?" one boy asked. "Because it's missing someone," Elias replied. "But the next part?" a girl piped up. "That's the part where you remember they're still with you in a way." The kids didn't care that he wasn't famous. They cared that he was honest, word spread. Soon, other schools invited him. He never charged. He just showed up, played, and listened. Sometimes a student would stay after class and say, "My dog died last month," or "My mom's sick," and Elias would sit with them in silence. Then play something soft and slow, just for them. Back at the conservatory, he kept writing. One evening, he finished a new piece, a duet for piano and violin titled Morning Light. He sent the score to Nia. She performed it at a small community concert the following month. People cried, not because it was sad, but because it felt like hope, carefully held. Months turned into a year. Elias never returned to the Orpheus stage for another solo performance, and that was fine. He'd said what he needed to say, but his music lived on, in classrooms, in late-night practice rooms, in the quiet moments between strangers who'd heard his story and felt less alone. One spring afternoon, he walked past the same lamppost where he'd seen the audition flyer over a year ago. It was covered in new posters now, ballet recitals, jazz nights, poetry readings. But tucked in the corner, slightly faded, was the original Orpheus notice. Its edges curled from rain and sun. He paused, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of music. His latest piece, simple and bright, called Still Here. He gently tucked it under the corner of the old flyer, where someone might find it and wonder. Then he walked on, hands in his pockets, heart light. He wasn't the man who'd vanished all those years ago, and he wasn't the man who'd stunned a theater with a single song. He was just Elias, still healing, still playing, still learning how to live with both joy and loss in the same breath. And that, he realized, was more than enough.